Our next guest is a freelance writer and editor, and the editor-in-chief of Belt Magazine, an independent online magazine covering the post-industrial Midwest. Her features and essays have appeared in Belt, The Reader, The Tribune, Cranes, Occupy.com, The Baffler, and the independent literary site The Rumpus, where she is the Sunday co-editor. She's also a company member with Chicago's Theater Oobleck, and the author of Soup and Bread Cookbook, Building Community One Pot at a Time, a narrative cookbook based on the long-running community meal project she organizes at the Hideout. Please put your hands together for Martha Bayne.
Thank you, Andrew and Eden. This is so what I'm going to read is a piece that is radically edited down from a much longer piece that I performed in January that is itself part of a much larger piece that still hasn't been written yet. So it's we'll see how it tracks, in other words. It's called The Memory Palace of Fear. I've always hated haunted houses. An apprehensive walk into darkness and the unknown does not thrill me. I do not relish the dreadful tease of creaking doors and rattling chains. I feel no catharsis when a chainsaw-wielding actor dripping with fake blood jumps up from the shadows, or when the lights bump to black and a skeletal claw clutches my shoulder. I have no desire to live through Rob Zombie's Great American Nightmare in Villa Park, or open the doors of the House of Torment in Morton Grove. In fact, a few Halloweens ago, when a friend cajoled me into entering the haunted trailer at a low-rent Western Michigan pumpkin patch, I couldn't make it past the moldering door. She and her 5-year-old forged ahead, and I stayed in the field in the twilight with her baby. I've just never been taken with the aesthetics of death, its precise iconography, its somber stories, all leading to a predictable end. In high school, I left the goths to their own black-clad, crucifix-rattling devices, and 30 years later, I still can't put on eyeliner, and I still can't watch a horror movie without squinting through the cracks between my fingers. As entertainment, death leaves me cold, and fear is no fun. But lately, I can't stop thinking about haunted houses, these malevolent dwellings that turn on their inhabitants. They seem somehow elementally American, the New World's interpretation of the ghost stories that tickled the fancy of Gothic Europe, and trafficked in the subversion of the church, or the patriarchy, and other systems of power. The spooks of the old world lurked around their gloomy castles, wreaking havoc and tantalizing readers with their undercurrents of sexual repression and their general ontological uncertainty. Did they really even exist at all, or were they the paranoid projections of a collapsing aristocracy? But in stories like The Fall of the House of Usher or Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, the existence of ghosts is no longer the question. It's the house itself that's doing the haunting. And in a 21st century America, supposedly liberated from the baked-in oppressions of religion, class, and gender, I'm stuck on this barb of a question. What does the modern haunted house, sentient, undead, possessed of a free and malicious will, subvert? What is a haunted house these days? Have you ever watched American Horror Story, the FX show by the guys who made Glee? I hadn't until recently when I made my way through most of season 1, most of it because, honestly, it's not a very good show. It piles up horror tropes and cliches in a presumably knowing pastiche that by mid-season is clearly going nowhere, save for a series of dead ends that are programmatically disrupted by bursts of gratuitous violence. But the house is a wonder. A looming brick and stained glass Tudor mansion with a turret, it is, hands down, the most haunted house in the history of haunted houses. It doesn't just have one ghost or two, it has 20 or maybe more, I lost count. It is a house of haunted excess. They haunt from every room, from the basement, from the attic, from under the gazebo, as the showrunners scramble to patch together what is supposed to be a psychological thriller, but only sometimes succeeds. And it has its charms, but to me the most interesting thing about American Horror Story is that the horror that drives it is truly, fundamentally, mundanely American. Do you remember that bit from Eddie Murphy's Notorious where he wonders why white people don't just leave the haunted house? In season 1 of American Horror Story, which originally aired in 2001, the Harmons can't leave their haunted house because they can't sell it. The market has collapsed, the economy's in the toilet, and nobody's buying. The Harmons, who start the pilot eager to make a fresh start in a new home in the promised land of Los Angeles, wind up trapped and killed by the housing bubble's burst. The Amityville Horror predated American Horror Story by 32 years, and like American Horror Story, it's also not very good. But despite wooden dialogue and furious overacting, the film does offer its own towering example of a sentient haunted house. A house with a face, the light in its pie-shaped attic windows famously blinking on to flank the nose of its chimney. In addition to bubbling up black gook from the toilet and inducing a nun to vomit, the house sends flies to swarm another pesky Catholic. It slams its window sash down on one child and electrocutes another. And it talks, for crying out loud. It's, "Get out!" The prompt that, to circle back for a second, famously inspired Eddie Murphy when he said, "A ghost say get the fuck out? I would just tip the fuck out the door." But just before the toilet bowl in the Amityville house filled up and then overflowed with ghastly black goo, Margot Kidder, virginal in a plaid skirt and knee socks, implored her new husband James Brolin, who, himself tormented by the pressures of mortgage and family, has become dismissive and cruel, to be kind to her aunt, the soon-to-be vomiting nun. "Come on, George," she says. "This is a big deal for my family. We've always been a bunch of renters. This is the first time anyone in my family has bought a house." I started writing this piece over Christmas in Los Angeles, where 3 months after the death of my father, I spent the holidays with my mother, rattling around a very large, fancy house belonging to a very wealthy friend, swaddled in thick wool blankets of grief against the unseasonably cold California wind. Behind locked gates and high hedges, the house sat secure, warm and clean, and haunted only by the cries of 2 hungry kittens. The cats, strays who had hit the Los Angeles jackpot and moved to the Palisades, got organic kibble and free run of the grounds, and the humans got the most mundane manifestation of plenty imaginable, a fully stocked pantry that included no fewer than 18 boxes of cereal. And I marveled blankly at those cereal boxes, knowing that whenever the children of the home's owners reached the bottom of a box of Honey Nut Cheerios, a fresh full box would magically appear the next day. In this house, money protected its inhabitants against want and insulated them from fear. At night, it was wrapped in an unearthly quiet, no traffic sounds, no rowdy neighbors, no creaky floors or chill winds, nothing going bump in the night. And every night in that big Los Angeles house, trying to find our equilibrium in the shifting ground of our family, we watched movies, new releases, Oscar contenders marked for your consideration. We watched Carol and Brooklyn and Spotlight, and we watched The Big Short. Now, The Big Short, as you may recall, is a comedy of sorts about the great subprime mortgage and credit default swap swindle of the zeros that first inflated the housing bubble and then precipitated the collapse of the market in 2008. It is made by the guy who made Anchorman, and it's got a bunch of big name stars like Ryan Gosling and Steve Carell in it, and it is funny. It's snappily edited and paced like a caper movie with direct address, fourth wall busting cameos from celebrities like Selena Gomez and Anthony Bourdain, explaining things like the logic of collateralized debt obligations. It's brash and loud and entertaining until suddenly it's not, and people are getting evicted and living out of their cars, losing their homes to foreclosure, or not able to cope, just disappearing one day and leaving everything behind, including the cereal on the table. And the comedy is sucked out of the film like the devil by a priest, and what's left behind is silent and heartbreaking. Watching The Big Short from the comfort of this very, very comfortable house was disorienting, and the floor lurched, rotting and unstable beneath me. What is a haunted house? Is a haunted house the collapse of the American dream? Now I'm going to drop some journalism on you. You can consider it our own Selena Gomez interlude. According to a 2014 report by the Chicago Reporter, there are an estimated 18,000 abandoned houses and apartment buildings in Chicago, and at least 1 in 5 have been empty since the early days of the foreclosure crisis in 2008 or 9. And of these 18,000 abandoned buildings, about half are tied one way or another to one of the 6 big banks doing business with the city. And with the inhabitants long gone, they sit empty and decaying, stripped of copper and fixtures, breeding grounds for vermin, havens for drugs and crime. And to their institutional owners, the upkeep isn't worth the money, so the banks just walk away, leaving them to die, often without following through on the foreclosure process. About 1/3 of them, 6,000, linger in this ownership limbo. The banks don't want them, the owners can't have them, and in the lingo of housing policy, these properties are known as zombies. Zombies. An army of them, 6,000 strong, stretching across Chicago, accountable to no one, ignored, underestimated, and hungry to feed on the city's pain. Did the mortgage crisis give birth to a city of undead houses? The red X's on their facades assigned to first responders to steer clear, not to bother trying to save them if they burn, not run the risk of being bit? And it's not just a city, it's a whole region. Gary, Detroit, Akron, Youngstown, in which red X's might as well be painted on the foreheads of the residents left for dead. as they have been in, of course, Flint, where the collapse of the industrial economy met the housing crisis and austerity governance lit the arsonist match. And consider this, pulled from the Washington Post a while back, one of many dispatches from a city where, until very recently, evil flowed through the veins of every house. The crisis has created a perfect storm to strip their houses of their remaining value, one resident says. People feel absolutely trapped, says another. We feel like prisoners in our own homes. We're being poisoned by the very homes we live in. What is a haunted house? Is it the brick-and-mortar manifestation of some unkillable evil? Now, the haunted house is popular entertainment, for which the term of art I have recently learned is haunted attraction, has roots that stretch all the way back to the booby-trapped labyrinths of Egyptian pyramids and the simple machines of Greek theater. But the modern haunted attraction is, like the haunted house stories of Poe and Jackson, a thoroughly American invention, born out of the traveling carnivals of the early 20th century, where patrons would pay money to enter the tent and walk the darkened aisles of the freak show. Later, the mid-century boom in amusement parks brought about the innovation of the haunted dark ride, in which patrons rode through the funhouse in little carts or trains, which reached its zenith with the opening in 1969 of Disneyland's Haunted Mansion, which I went to for the first time last month for research. But even during the Depression, people were beginning to stage their own haunted attractions around Halloween, in part as a way to keep kids out of trouble. An article in Smithsonian Magazine cites a 1937 pamphlet that offers parents instructions on how to create a trail of terror, there's a lot of scare quotes, in the cellar or attic using damp sponges, pieces of old fur, and strips of raw liver on the walls. And haunted attractions really took off in the 70s when they were popularized by the JCs, whose members staged thousands of haunted houses across the country in abandoned buildings and cornfields. And these annual fundraisers were so successful that in 1975, 2 members of the Bloomington, Illinois chapter published a handbook to building and marketing your own haunted attraction that sold more than 20,000 copies, and which is sadly now out of print. And of course, also in the 70s, evangelical Christians tapped into their own history of medieval pageants to stage elaborate hell houses, gory, graphic attractions designed to terrorize teenagers with the threat of eternal damnation as the consequence of premarital sex, drug use, abortion, homosexuality, and other sins. Jerry Falwell opened the first such hell house in Virginia in 1972. And 40-some years later, haunted attractions are big business. Today, the estimated 2,700 professionally run haunted houses in the U.S. rake in as much as $30 million a year. And perhaps taking an unintentional cue from Jerry Falwell, they're as likely to terrorize visitors with horrors ripped from the traumas of life as they are with the supernatural and spooky. At the long-running blackout haunted houses in New York and LA, visitors have been taken hostage and grabbed, hooded and waterboarded by unseen jailers. Locally, the Rob Zombie house notoriously featured scenarios inspired by the atrocities of the Manson family, David Berkowitz, and John Wayne Gacy. And even the relatively low rent The Raven's Grin, an unlicensed haunted house outside of Galena, which is run by one obsessed guy, is decorated with such an alarming amount of Nazi paraphernalia that I've heard it makes visitors deeply unsettled if they're not already. In these contemporary haunted houses, the real-life chills run up against the unapologetic absurdity of the whole idea. Some haunted house actors, I've heard, compete to see how many patrons they can scare into peeing their pants, or worse. A friend of mine who years ago worked at a haunted house in the Chicago suburbs told me it was actually traumatic. The constant noise, the darkness, and worst of all, the way the panicked public would turn on the performers, cursing at them, fighting, sometimes punching them in the face. What is a haunted house, after all, but a way of training the populace to accept the unthinkable, and then perhaps perpetuate it? Is it a coincidence that the 1950s, the Donna Reed, sock hop, leave it to Beaver 50s, was the last moment the American dream seemed to hold water? When it was possible to get that good job at the plant, work 40 years, raise a family, buy a house. And yet it was also the era in which, across the Midwest, the Victorian homes of the 18th century began to fall into disrepair as suburbia sprang up around them. And to warn kids away, to keep them from going exploring and falling through a hole or stepping on a rusty nail or getting bit by a rat, adults made up ghost stories. Don't go in that house, they said. It's haunted. Once upon a time, a haunted house was a story we told children to keep them safe. And in the 70s, when I was little, every Halloween, my friend Tanya's father, perhaps taking his cues from the JCs or that 1937 pamphlet, would make a haunted house in his basement, transforming it with cardboard and cobwebs from a spray can into what seemed at the time a labyrinth of frights. There was no liver on the walls, but there was spooky music, flashing lights, cold spaghetti brains on the ground, and peeled grape eyeballs in a bowl. I love this, and I look forward to it every year. The lure of the haunted maze wrapped up in the allure of her dad's place across town. I remember her mildly hippie-ish father as gentle and kind, his little house shabby and smelling vaguely of incense, or maybe it was pot. And wildly exotic when compared to the square bungalow down the street from me, where Tanya lived with her mom and her sister all but every other weekend. Harry's house may have been haunted, but it was deeply protectively safe. And once you made your way through the basement maze, you were rewarded with hot cider and candy in the kitchen. But after that, my interest in haunted houses waned, and again, until very recently. Because I'm curious. Because the promised function of a haunted house as a safe space in which to confront your fears, whether they're childhood terrors of darkness and spiders or the externally wrought horrors of poverty, is ringing pretty hollow. And I can't stop thinking about the ways in which across the country, homes under the influence of outside forces, whether evil spirits, emergency managers, or dead fathers, subvert their promise of safety and turn on their inhabitants. Nowadays, the haunted house may still be a story for children, but it's not clear who, if anyone, it is keeping safe. Instead, I started to think of a haunted house as a memory palace, a thoroughly modern mnemonic device for the collective remembrance of fear. Walk through it room by room, and you walk alongside ghosts and zombies, roaches and rats, eviction and abandonment and loneliness and loss. And I can't say whether you'll be entertained, you might very well pee your pants, but to me the greater question is whether we will altogether be released or just terrorized into acceptance.